thank you and welcome. I'm sure those numbers will continue to climb with a healthy number of registrations for this Curious Convos webinar. Tonight for me, this morning and tonight for Nicky, this morning for Christian, and people all over the world with us for this session, looking at the registration list, and certainly people going to be tuning in later if you can't make it just now. Thank you for doing that. We're going to try something a bit different. We're going to have a conversation, do what all of us on this call love to do regularly whenever we get together. We never pass up an opportunity to talk about coaching and education. And what we're inviting you to do here is to pull up a chair, join us in that conversation. We have some questions to get us started, but we would love for you to post questions in the question and answer box there, and or in the chat box. Probably better to put your questions in the question and answer, and the chat box to use that for sharing links, sharing other or comments and thoughts as we go. Before I introduce our panelists, and myself, actually, I've just started talking without introducing myself, but our names are on the screen. What I'd like to invite you to do is to open up the chat box, if you can see that there on the screen. And thank you already. Angie, thank you. Angie has said hello from Wagga. Hello from rural New South Wales. Thank you. If you can all just go in there and say hello and say where you are, because we've looked at the registration list for this, and it's probably the most geographically diverse group we've had in any of these. Having said that, now we may well look at this, and it's not all the Aussies. Thank you, Siobhan, for holding up the Singapore bit there, and we'll give you a shout out as we go. So just to introduce ourselves, so my name is Chris Monroe. I'm Managing Director at GCI, and I'm based here in Melbourne and look after operations in Australia and New Zealand. Dr. Nicky Knight is joining us from Auckland this evening for us. And Nicky is the Director for Growth Coaching New Zealand and looks after our work and coordinates all of our work with a great team of people in New Zealand. Claudia is our Director of Programs, based in Sydney, sadly locked down in the latest roller coaster of COVID twist that we have this evening in New South Wales. Thank you. And Professor Christian van Nieuwburg, I'll give you your grand title this evening, Christian, or this morning, who's our Executive Director and leading academic and researcher in the world of coaching and education. So we're lucky. We count ourselves as privileged in working with GCI that we get to work with leading academics in the field as well. So you're going to be tuning in, sitting alongside us as we chew on some questions, some topics around coaching and education. What we'd really like to do is privilege the questions that come up for you during this conversation as well. So if something pops into your head and you've got one of those, oh, I need to ask that moments, please type it into the question and answer box. We'll see it pop up, and we'll pull away from what we might be discussing at the time to answer those and privilege those. So it's more interactive, a bit more free form. Christian, before we came on, I think you said it's like, GCI unplugged, which is a lovely way of putting it. It's us jamming about coaching and education, if you like, if that's not too lame, I think, to say. But yeah, I think that's the way we want it to feel. But we've got some starter questions to get us started. So thank you for saying hello in the chat box. By all means, if you've just arrived, please say hello and where you're from. There's a few well-known names there. Welcome, Richard. I know you're normally in County Down, but you're on your holidays in Stoke-on-Trent, so you're traveling around. Thank you. We've got another Northern Irish contribution there, Debbie. Thank you. And all over Australia as usual, and Japan as well. Great, thank you, Noriko. Yeah, welcome everybody. So a nice international contingent. So it's going to be a good one. All right, so if I just kick off maybe then we had a few questions posted. I appreciate everybody's busy and everybody's dealing with various levels of holidays, term times, COVID restrictions and so on, but we did get a few responses to our call out for questions. And we've kind of organized them into some general themes here that are probably, in our experience in coaching and training, they are frequently asked questions anyway, but if others pop up, then ask them. So the first kind of broad question is around what's in everybody in education's mind just now? What's the evidence? What's the answer to how do we know coaching makes a difference in education settings? And the way we're going to do this is throw to somebody to lead off on that question, then we'll just chip in as we go. So Christian, as a resident research guru here, I won't big you up anymore, I promise. I'm going to throw that one to you first. Yeah, how do we know it makes a difference?
Thank you, Chris. And yeah, it's so exciting to see people from all over. So noticed Ireland, different parts of Australia, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Manly. And yes, hello to everyone. Thank you for joining. That's an important question for us to ask around coaching in education, because, you know, coaching in education does make a difference to people's lives, and particularly, I think, to the lives of students and educators. So it is very important that there is evidence. And one of the people on this call right now, Margaret Barr, my wonderful colleague and friend, she leads our work in Scotland. Margaret Barr and I actually had this question maybe a little while ago, and we have put together a document that captures all of the research that Margaret and I have been able to identify. So Chris, it might be useful to share that. Just two things I want to say about that. One is, since the early 2000s, there's been quite a bit of research into coaching in education, and there's a growing body of research. There's even a journal that's dedicated to coaching and mentoring in education. I do recommend that, International Journal of Mentoring and Coaching in Education. There's a growing body of research, in other words, that supports this work. I also see that Dawn is on here from Sydney, and Dawn was at something that GCI hosts with Leeds Beckett University, and in partnership with the Instructional Coaching Group in the US. We have this Coaching and Mentoring in Education Research Network. And Chris, it's so exciting to hear about all the new research that's going on, PhD level, postgraduate level, postdoctorate level. So I'm encouraged that there's a lot of research going on into what makes a difference. That's one question. The question we're really addressing now is, how does coaching make a difference? So that's another exciting area. And only a couple of days ago, good news from the UK is that the British Psychological Society has just recognized coaching psychology as a division. And that's a huge step forward for the field of coaching in general. And I do think it has implications for us in education as well, because it's a growing field, and I think there's a growing and encouraging evidence base. I don't know what others think.
I would just add to that very briefly. I think the two main reasons we know that coaching makes a difference in education is because of the research, the growing research, which Christian has just highlighted. But the other point I'd like to make is the growing amount of people in education who are taking up coaching training, being coached as leaders, coaches training their middle leaders. So the fact that we're seeing more coach training happening in education, I think, is a testament to the fact that the people who are being trained can see this works, these conversations and the ways, the skills that we bring into the conversations we have with others is useful. And you can see this through the conversations we have with schools. It's not just leaders amongst each other, it's leaders with their staff, it's peers, it's teachers with their learners or their students, and it's even with the parents. So that's how we can see that it's really making an impact, because there's this amazing positive ripple effect that's actually encompassing the whole educational community. So it's not just an impact on the leaders. So that's how I think the impact is really becoming quite broad now.
I think you're right, Claudia. I think the document that you highlighted there, Christian, you've said before, it's grown since when you and Margaret first produced it. It was, I don't know, dozen pages or something like that. It's nearly 70 pages long now, because it's a rapidly growing area of research and literature in coaching and education in particular. Nicky, I might invite you to say something about some of the case studies. New Zealand is a rich source of success stories of coaching and education, and where it might not sit as evidence in terms of the research world, it's certainly implementation evidence that we draw heavily on, and is really inspiring. And it's why we do what we do. We get a great privilege in the work we do, that we get to witness what people do after the training, so I don't know if you want to say something about that, Nicky.
You're absolutely right. I mean, we have some schools that are just dedicated to coaching and see it as a way to learn, develop and grow. And of course we have video enhanced coaching that has been really successful in some of our schools. And so teachers are videoing lessons and then having coaching conversations, when they're looking at those videos. And so that's been really exciting. And probably just in the last few years too, with students coaching students. So we know that that avenue really makes a difference to students achieving goals and being focused on the directions that they want to head. So really exciting directions in some of our schools. So it's making a difference to definitely teachers, teaching practice, and also students achieving their goals. Yeah.
I think what's really impressive about a lot of those stories, and we've got some on the podcast and we've got some on various bits of the website just now, is that there is actually tangible evidence. You hear from the teachers, you hear from the students coaching student stories are amazing in New Zealand. You've been doing it longer than anybody else. It's when you hear the students enthuse about what a difference it's made to them. And we know that there's research to back that up as well in some of the work you've done, Christian, but hearing it literally from the horse's mouth is so compelling. And what we're working hard on is actually capturing those stories as well. And I think it's inspiring to the wider education community too. Christian, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, just to tie it together, it is important for us to acknowledge when we say evidence. The most important evidence is what happens in schools with students, with educators. So one thing I'm really welcoming is more educators getting involved in the research themselves. And that's why that research network I talked about, so exciting. You've got school leaders, you've got teachers, you've got everybody in the education sector getting involved in the research around this. And there's those three things that for me are always connected. The practice, that's the bit that we want to influence. But then the practice should be based on some kind of research. But by doing research, we develop theories about how things might work. Then the theory informs the practice raises questions. And it's just so exciting for us to be in the midst of all of that. And at GCI, I think what we're really so committed to doing is being right in the middle of this with a clear focus on practice. That's what drives us, like Chris said, like Nicky said, like Claudia is suggesting. What gets us excited, what gets us up in the morning is the difference it's making. But we're making sure that it's based on research and evidence because of what I said at the beginning. These things do change people's lives. So we just need to make sure we're using the best knowledge we have.
Sure. I think there's another angle to this, Christian, you've just flagged with me, is that when we talk about the research or the evidence that underpins coaching approaches in schools, we're not just talking about research into coaching per se. We're talking about the theories and research that inform the approach. So things like motivational theory, positive psychology, all the bodies of work, significant bodies of research work, their solution-focused approaches and so on, that underpin the way we do coaching in schools and the way we're helping educators deploy it. There's different levels or layers, I suppose, I'm seeing there as well. So John, thank you. John's adding some bits into the chat box there and some other stories and links and resources. By all means, folks, post some questions if you've got further questions that pop up as we go. Otherwise, we'll continue working through some of these different levels of questions that we've got here, if that's okay. So I'll maybe just move on at this point. So that another kind of quite high level, broad question that's come up is how we would describe a coaching culture. And again, if we had $1 for every time a school leader picks up the phone to us or gets in touch and says, I'd like to develop a school coaching culture, And the next logical question is often, so what would that look like to you? What is it you expect to see as a result of that? So how would we describe a coaching culture? And the supplementary to that is what can schools do to build and strengthen that culture? So I think I'll lead off on this one. That's okay, because there is a bit of writing on that as well, Christian. That there is a book chapter. Shameless plug. I just happen to have it here. There is a book chapter that we will be able to share quite soon, actually, because the embargo is finished on it. So hopefully in the next GCI Insights, we'll share this article chapter. So myself, Margaret Barr, and Christian wrote a chapter on coaching cultures for learning. Was the title we had to start with, and it became creating a coaching culture in schools. And the fact that we were wrestling with what to call it probably suggests strongly now, looking back on that long journey of writing that, Christian, because it was a bit of a tortuous process for us over years. Trying to articulate what that meant was actually a learning process in itself. And the fact that we kept changing what we call that chapter was a sign that the thinking was still emerging and evolving. And for me, I think that's one of the big messages about a coaching culture. Same as any kind of cultural change, it's a kind of fuzzy, intangible concept at times until you start to nail down what are the things you would expect to see more of. What would be the signs that it was starting to emerge? And what we found ourselves using was a lot of language that was quite tentative, provisional, organic even, that this is a thing that emerges. And saying I'm going to implement a coaching culture is a bit too finite and definitive, to if that's the right word, to capture the essence of what it's about. And then I found myself describing to people how it was contextually specific. And I got a bit of pushback at one point on that sounds like a cop-out. Does that mean you know nothing and it's just all contextual and there's no, well, I think what we realized in that process is there are some things that are key features. So what we tried to define in there, and I'm not going to read the definition to you, but we tried to define what would a coaching culture in an educational context look like. And if you use maybe the global framework to go back to that way of thinking about coaching and mentoring and education, we would expect to see that ripple effect that Claudia had talked about of coaching and coach-like conversational behaviors. That's not the way we described it either, Christian, but that's just emerged out of my mouth this minute, so it's still organic. We'd expect to see evidence of people intentionally, and I think that's an important word, intentionally utilizing coaching and coaching approaches to conversations across a whole range of conversational contexts in their school. So those conversational contexts can be community, leadership, parents, students. But we would see that effect on conversations. It's how we talk around here is the way I sometimes sum it up. And what we talk about or how we relate or converse around here. We'd see that across the community. But we went a step further in our definition and said, and we would expect to see it embedded in school strategy and strategic planning. We'd see the words of coaching and coaching as a way of professional learning and the way we converse embodied in the strategic intent and documentation of the school as well. So that's kind of based on some of the research in the wider world of what coaching cultures look like. And Christian, you'd done some of that work with Helen Gormley. We took that and related it to coaching and education. Now, what are the signs of that? I think that's where it would be different. What's your starting point? I think that would be different depending. And the key consideration I would leave you with is, what are the antecedent conditions to this? Are you just trying to establish this against a blank canvas? Nobody ever is, even with a brand new school, you're not. So what under what conditions and into what existing framework are you trying to do this work? And what might need to change as a result of that. So that's what we've tried to help people think about in that chapter, and try to kind of capture what the essence of it is.
Thank you, Chris. Excellent. A lot of research questions emerged from there, particularly with the antecedents. That's a great question. Nicky and Claudia, I'm just kind of curious in relation to this. When you are in a school, what are the kind of little signals or clues that make you think, you know what, there's a coaching culture here?
So certainly I would say there's a co-construction in conversations where the coach is obviously supporting the coachee to find their own way forward. So I really like that. And I would also say a culture of inquiry rather than advocacy. So asking, certainly rather than telling. Teachers hopefully applying their learning more deeply, frequently, consistently than they would be if they were working on their own. And I think underpinning all of this is the whole concept of trust. So that there's a high level of trust within the organisation between individuals and between groups of individuals. So I think those are some of the things that I would see. How about you, Claudia?
Yeah, just to add to that, I would say that there's transparency and clear communication. I would also say that it's something that's been rolled out slowly over time. There's an organicness about it, that it's not rushed or forced. And I also would say that there's a level of reflection on practice and what's happening, what they would like to see happen. And there's a little bit of meta coaching going on, where we're starting to build layers of coaching within school organisations, where you might have some more experienced coaches, supporting new and emerging people who are learning about coaching, and also with the student body.
Thank you, Claudia. I wonder if I could invite the attendees also, to answer that question in the chat. What are the kinds of things you would notice in a place that has a coaching culture? It is interesting, isn't it? Because that original article that Chris mentioned that I worked on with Helen Gormley, it was the idea of coaching cultures more broadly. But the more we've thought about this idea of coaching cultures for learning, for example, I think there's, and Nicky in her response kind of alluded to this, there is something particularly appropriate about coaching cultures in educational settings.
Yes.
Because there's something about co-construction, this idea of learning together, of curiosity. And it is fascinating just to think, I get to visit schools in different places as well. And sometimes you just pick up a few things to think, okay, this feels like it. So culture of inquiry rather than advocacy. And we'd see it right throughout the school. That's what's exciting. It's in the interaction between students as well. You can sometimes see it. It's in the interaction of anybody in that school environment. It's how you feel as a visitor to that school even. So I love that. Curiosity over judgment, Sharon says.
Nice.
I like that.
Nice, dialing up your curiosity. Christian, I think those are great questions, and that we're kind of modeling a coaching approach here, aren't we, in the way we're hosting this. The other link to that is, and again, the sign of this is still an emerging concept. We even questioned, at one point I remember us honestly questioning, is there such a thing as a coaching culture? We think there is, but it's still emerging, I think. And Cameron Patterson and Cameron is a big advocate of cultures of thinking. Ron Richards' work, a lot of you will be familiar with that, Project Zero at Harvard and so on. And he made the link, because Cameron's done some work on coaching with us, and we've talked about this for many years, and invited me to collaborate with him a while ago on the links between cultures of thinking and the moves you make, the linguistic moves you make as an educator to generate thinking in the students. And he saw a resonance between that and coaching. And when we were talking about coaching culture for learning, Christian, I do wonder, is a culture of thinking as an organization, an organizational way of being, rather than an individual way of being, is that what it's about? But it's the right question to ask. What are the signs of that? How do you know it's actually happening? Yeah. Love it.
I'm seeing the chat. Phil says a school that embraces learning through failure and growth through iteration. So it has to have that psychological safety where it's okay, one, to fail and take risks, but two, to talk about it and to learn from it. Excellent.
Yeah.
Danielle, trust is a big one. And, on that trust point, coming back to Chris's commentary about this, is that an antecedent? Do we need to have trust first, or is it something that comes out of coaching? I like that. And Danielle's point, this is all about getting the best out of everybody in a school context. That's what's driving us. So another question is, what does the culture need to be like so that we can have teachers at their best, leaders at their best, administrators at their best, students at their best? So I do like the thinking there. Trust, open and clear communication. Siobhan says collaboration comes up again and again. Janice, trusted relationships of professional learning and relationships first. Coming back to the research into coaching, the one thing that seems to have the biggest impact is relationships. So I remember talking to John Campbell, our founding director, who's actually on this call today. So hi, John, about the idea that of course relationships matter, but in that context, so do conversations. And that idea that we have at GCI, that the quality of the conversation can have a positive impact on the quality of the relationship, et cetera, et cetera. So this is fascinating.
I love the way this is evolving, Christian. There is a question from Phil. Hi, Phil, a fellow Victorian here, that I'm going to come to in a second. But you raised the thing about trust there, and Danielle and others, Siobhan did as well. And Claudia, you sowed the seeds of that. One of the questions we did get was around, it's that chicken and egg question that you just highlighted, Christian. Does the trust have to be there first? And I've used that metaphor in the past. Does there have to be fertile ground? Do you have to treat it, get it ready, and get it all perfectly conditioned before you plant the seeds of coaching? Or can it happen more organically? Can you actually nudge culture and build trust by getting started? I'd actually welcome some contributions, because I know, Janice, you've got lots of lived experience of implementing this as well. You were one of our podcasts recently. But I'd be interested in responses to that. Nicky, I don't know if you've got a thought on that, because it's related to Phil's question there as well, I think, that we'll come to.
True. I mean, I think trust can certainly be there. I just wanted to actually come back to another point when you were talking about relationships, and we have a wonderful concept called whanaungatanga, and it's relationships are absolutely central to connectedness. And of course, our Māori believe that bond needs to exist in order to have great relationships. So I really like that term. So it just says Māori believe that a bond needs to exist to be nurtured, understood, to understand each other, and to be actively nurtured for strong relationships to be made. But so I love that term. So that's very strongly embedded in what we do here. But that was the trust, coming back to the trust, Chris, is that right?
Yeah. So just, that question is around, and there's kind of a hint of that in those comments there as well.
Yeah.
Can you build trust through coaching, or does the trust have to be there first?
I mean, I think it can be both. I think that you can have trust to begin with, and then maybe your coaching becomes even stronger. But I also think coaching can contribute to strengthening trust within an organization. So it's kind of, I'm probably going to sit on the fence on that one and go both ways.
I think it's a legitimate question. Claudia? Yeah.
I would agree with Nicky. I think both. I think if you begin with high trust environments or high trust relationships within your context, I think uptake might be quicker. However, I would say that what we know about coaching and coach training, implementation, or using coaching as a strategy, or using coaching approach as a strategy, is that it's respectful, it's thought-provoking, and that the nature of coaching in itself does build trust through that connectiveness in relationships. So going back to relationships, so I think I'm with Nicky on that one. It's both.
Yeah, and if I can just add one thought, and then let's go to that question, Chris. But people have said, how long does it take? And I'm going to support what Claudia said here. The one thing that's consistent with all types of culture, but particularly this, is it takes time. Yeah. And if somebody were to say, well, how long does that take? I would say forever. I think we never get to a coaching culture. And I mean that in the most positive way. I think it's something that we should always be working on. But when should we start? Despite the kind of questions we've got about antecedents, I think start now. And the small things we do, improve the quality of the conversations, be more intentional. So it is kind of a symbiotic relationship, isn't it? I wouldn't want people waiting and saying, well, the climate's not right, the ground's not fertile. The thing would be, how can we make the ground more fertile? And in doing that, we're starting to create the kind of culture that we want to be part of.
Yeah, I agree, Christian. I think, and there's an acceptance at the start that this will be an organic process and it will emerge, but that doesn't mean completely shapeless. There still can be some planning and direction behind that. I think the other thing I would throw in here just before we go to this is that notion of there's two levels of trust that often emerge in these implementation conversations. One is trust in the individual. So I think in my own implementation story in school, where it was just start with a coalition of the willing, start somewhere and walk the talk. And what that did was build the trust in me as the coach. But then eventually the trust comes in the process. There's trust in the system and the intent behind it, and there's trust in the actual individuals. And I think if you don't have both of those, but one maybe follows the other, definitely. And I think that's some of the issues that Phil is raising here as well. I'll go to the question. I'll read it out because I realize everybody can't see the question box there. So Phil's saying, although an effective practice or flourishing culture of educational coaching is hopefully devoid of power dynamic, the hierarchical structure of schools, and this is one of those educational context specific things, Christian, the hierarchical structure of schools generally means some type of differential is at play, some perceived or actual power differential. I think, Phil, there definitely. Is there an example or possibility for junior or staff without official leadership title to coach upwards in the hierarchy? For example, a year level coordinator coaching a deputy principal.
Yeah.
What are your views on that? Nikki, you've got something to say about that. Go on.
Most definitely. I mean, coaching is a process, and there's an equal partnership involved. So certainly, a teacher can coach a deputy principal, most definitely.
And if I may add, I think when we're talking about little things that we would notice, those are the kinds of things we would see where power dynamics are intentionally set aside. And Nicky, I'm going to remember back to a conference you kindly invited me to in New Zealand. And just a perfect example of this, Phil, was I got to see, I think it was a 10-year-old coach coaching a principal. So these things are possible, and there's no more powerful way to show a coaching culture than a school leader who's open to be coached in public, things like that. So really some inspiring stories there about this.
Definitely. I think part of it, Phil, as well is actually naming that dynamic in the way you just did. And often we forget about that. We talk about contracting and coaching, about setting up the expectations and the parameters, actually naming that power dynamic up front, naming that the school structure kind of implies a hierarchical nature to this relationship, but also naming the boundaries. Christian, you've talked before about ethical moments of choice. That's something I often quote you on. One of those ethical moments of choice is if I'm the leader and I'm your coach, or if it's the other way around, how challenging am I allowed to be? How candid am I allowed to be? And is there a duty of care thing that kicks in? So I think naming those things up front, so we know what to expect and we know what we're getting into, actually helps build the trust in the process and the person as well. But I don't think there's any reason why somebody more junior, to use your word, can't coach, provide that thinking service for somebody anywhere else in the food chain, if you want to put it that way. Yeah. So we've jumped into the trust building bits here. I'm just checking if there's, no, that one's fine. So I'm just going to carry on. We did delve into some things there around hierarchy, around structure, that chicken and egg, trust first, trust later. There are a couple of short, sharp questions that often come up quite frequently. And one is everyone coachable? And the other one is, can everybody be a coach? And I see your thoughtful face there, Christian. I'm going to invite your response to that, and Claudia as well there. Yeah.
Well, just to be a bit cryptic, I'll just give a one-word answer. Is everybody coachable? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Claudia?
Yes, can I add to that? I would say yes, if people are open to the process of self-reflection, most definitely. The only caveat I would put on that would be, my background is in psychology, so I'm speaking from a position of kind of experience in saying that if there are some serious or underlying mental health issues, it can be unhelpful, because in coaching, we are asking people to think broadly and deeply, challenge some of their mental models and those of others. And for somebody who might have a serious or struggling with some mental health issues, that might be difficult. But what I would say, and what I have done, is I have coached people in tandem to having counselling.
Right.
So I think, apart from that caveat, I think if people are open to the process, anyone can be coached. There is that issue of mandated versus a voluntary buy-in. Of course, the voluntary buy-in is a much easier route. However, I would say I've had many coachees who have been mandated to have coaching. The thing that I've found works the best and helps build a successful, trustful relationship in the coaching is to name that up front. And I've said, I understand that you've been kind of asked to have this coaching. You haven't voluntarily bought into it. I name that up front. We talk about it. You're having this coaching now. It's been paid for. I'm your coach. How can we best work together that would be most helpful for you? I find naming that right up front at the beginning of the coaching relationship actually breaks down the barriers, and it actually acknowledges that they haven't asked to have this coaching. Yeah. So I find that it goes back to that concept of trust again, and that concept of transparency, which I mentioned earlier on, which I think is critical in coaching and building, useful relationship.
Yeah, thank you for that broader perspective. And I think what you're saying there, if we flip it around, is none of us would say people are uncoachable. We want to hear that. But what you seem to be articulating there from the counselling perspective is that sometimes coaching is not the right intervention for that person at that time. And that's an important distinction for us to make. We're not here as advocates of coaching to say coaching is the answer all the time. There's a real danger in that, ethical and otherwise, in that. But we are saying it's a pretty helpful way of conversing most of the time with professionals who, I think our colleague Dave T has done some research on this in his doctorate around people's readiness for coaching and what those things are. And one of the phrases we often use from Mark McKergow is, are people customers for change? Do they see the compelling need for change? And when they do, then yes, they're in a highly coachable state. Putting all the other, psychological issues to one side, I think, Claudia. Yeah. Christian, you're going to add something to that?
Nothing to add. I just really appreciate commentary. Nicky, what do you think?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I think you've raised some really interesting points that it's important for the coach to know whether they're sort of getting into an area that's outside their expertise and knowing when to stop. That's more about the coach possibly than about the coachee, but everybody is coachable. Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's more successful with some than others for a whole host of reasons, but everybody is coachable.
Yeah. And I think Claudia's point about openness to critical reflection, I would argue actually that that people need support to be critically reflective as well. I don't think critical reflection is an innate ability that you have or don't have, but some people are more predisposed maybe to thinking that way, be more open. But there are frameworks and tools and techniques that we can help people use to elicit that kind of reflection.
Something I've thought about while we're talking is to kind of connect, because that idea of readiness is important in both questions. So is everybody coachable? Yes, the question is, are they ready for coaching? And can anybody be a coach? The same thing, are they ready to be a coach? And to link back to what we were saying, the coaching culture, one of the questions of the coaching culture is, how do we increase that readiness across our group of people?
Okay.
Can I just add to that, Christian, to quote some of Christian's work around psychological tensions, I think, can anybody be a coach? I would say yes, if you have the correct mindset and openness. But the thing I think is really important is your ability to be able to let go of the expert mindset in the coaching relationship and be that passenger rather than the driver, which I think at the beginning of our coaching journey is one of the biggest psychological struggles. So we're not saying that you are not an expert and let go of your expertise. What we are saying is, in this conversation, it's not helpful or necessary to allow the other person to grow and develop. So I think there are some really interesting psychological tensions in coaching as we become coaches, and we develop this over time. And how do we develop this? Through practice. Through practice and through reflection and through supervision, hopefully, as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that the word there was becoming, Christian, Claudia, becoming a coach. It's a process, and That when people ask me, that can everybody be a coach? I think everyone can learn techniques and structures. If you think about our 3 elements of coaching with the growth framework and the skills and the way of being, the bit that's harder or takes longer, that's a work in progress. That's probably the number 1 out of the 3 for me, is the way of being. Whereas I can learn to and practice my listening. I can learn some nice questions that are more incisive than the ones I might have used to ask. I can follow a growth framework to give a bit more structure and shape to my conversation. That will make your conversations possibly a lot better than they were before. But to really get to the heart of it and coach really effectively, I think that way of being is the number 1. That's a work in progress and a slightly fuzzier, less tangible concept.
Yeah, this is why I think coaching and education can be so important, because when you train to become a coach, and the question you're asking is, how do I need to be so that the people around me can grow and develop? And this is exactly this is what education is all about, isn't it? And so what we call the coaching way of being is also a wonderful educator way of being. And I think that's why coach training has benefits beyond you're going to learn how to be a coach. And I think it ties into what you were saying, Chris, is it forces us to start asking questions about my way of being. It forces us to be quite reflective about ourselves and the impact we have on others. So I think huge possible benefits of coach training beyond I'm now a coach.
Especially in leadership training, I see the coaching skills as absolutely fundamental to good leadership in schools as well.
Can I just say, I think there's an amazing reciprocity in coaching. And, I know Jim, our colleague Jim Knight, uses this a lot. And the reciprocity, I think, and what I've learned in my coaching journey is that every time I coach someone, I'm supporting them in their thinking, but I'm actually also learning. And they're supporting me in my way of being because I've become a better listener. I'm asking better questions. I've learned to let go of ego and expertise when I come into the relationship and just really be present. So there's an amazing reciprocity in coaching that over time, as you said, Chris, this kind of coaching way of being develops. And I would say for people who are early on in their journey in coaching is, the more you coach, the more you learn about yourself and the more you become a better coach. So this reciprocity is, I think, something that is not found in lots of other conversations. And I think this developmental way of being that we create through every coaching interaction we have actually makes us a better coach and supports the person we're coaching at the same time.
I think you've nailed it, Claudia. That's it. Reciprocity is that privilege that we get in doing what we do. And I think we often joke when we're doing our training programs that you can't actually be any other way once you become a coach. It's hard to operate differently, go back to your old default settings. We've changed our default settings by becoming a coach. And I think that's part of the challenge, part of what we're trying to do here and help others to do. So we get a deep personal insight into that person's personal and professional world that nobody else really gets because of that confidential space we create in coaching. And I think that's a really privileged position that can't not impact on our way of being and our reciprocal learning in that process. Brilliant. Thank you. Any final words or final questions or comments from the audience? We've got a minute till we said we'd do it in 45 minutes. I think we've covered a range of topics there. We did have 1 or 2 other little topics we might have got to, but I think we were honest, Nicky, and we knew we wouldn't. We talked about some of these earlier. We flagged a couple of other topics that came up for future episodes of Curious Convos that might be whole topics in themselves. And one of those I'll just flag just now is around that notion of intercultural sensitivity and how that's part of way of being. I think we'll come back to that in a chat on its own. Claudia.
Can I quickly answer Dawn's question? I've got a really great analogy for that. How do we put aside the expertise during instructional coaching though? So I always look at, and this is quite simplistic, but I think it paints a picture. If you think of mentoring, and if you take a car analogy, as the mentor, I'm sitting in the driver's seat and my mentee is sitting in the passenger seat. In coaching, as the coach, I'm sitting in the passenger seat and my coachee is sitting in the driver's seat. In instructional coaching, you're co-piloting, because in instructional coaching, you are required to bring your expertise if necessary and if helpful. So I hope that's a really quick analogy if you think about it. So it's just shifting where is the position I'm sitting in. So I think it's co-piloting, and you might need to bring some.
I like that, Claudia.
expertise.
I might need to rewrite an article based on what you've just said. But I think, Dawn, I would agree that in coaching, in any form of coaching, be it instructional or otherwise, however you want to define it, the coachee is always in the driver's seat. They're always the prime decision maker. That doesn't stop you from sharing your expertise and your wisdom. If you're called an instructional coach, you said the word expectation there, Claudia, quite rightly. There's an expectation that you bring some knowledge that might be of use to me. If you don't share it at any point, I'm going to think you're a hopeless instructional coach. So it's knowing how and when to deploy that expertise in a way that keeps them in the driving seat. I think that's the key nuanced kind of thing to be thinking about there. We could do a whole conversation on that another time as well. That's a great one. Any final comments or words from the panel before we wrap up? Just a thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
For being here. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. We've got lots more topics to talk about.
We do. So I'm just going to share the screen briefly here just to wrap this up. Thank you all to all of our panelists. Thank you for those of you who came along, and thank you for those of you who registered. You may be watching this later on. I hope you agree that that was an interesting and stimulating conversation. If you want to stay connected, you want to make sure that you don't miss out on future events that we're running, then you all sadly know what QR codes are for these days. So there's a QR code on the screen, or you can connect with us on our various channels, the website, email, social media, and so on. And please do continue to share that wider coaching and education community with others in your networks as well. So thank you. Final thanks from me. Thanks to my colleagues, wonderful colleagues that I get to work. I've got to pinch myself every day that I get to work with people like this. That this is quite a body of knowledge and expertise that we've built as an organisation, and it's our privilege to be able to share it with you. So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
We'll see you next time.